All right, let's talk about something that affects all of us but isn't always front and center in daily conversations. The Australian economy. Specifically, how it feels like the game is rigged against the middle class. If you've ever worked hard, paid your taxes, and still felt like you're running on a financial treadmill going nowhere, you're not alone. And no, you're not imagining it. Despite putting in the hours, making responsible financial decisions, and doing everything right, many Australians find themselves barely keeping up. Wages don't seem to stretch as far as they used to, and no matter how much effort is put in, the cost of living keeps climbing. It's a system that often rewards those at the top, while leaving the average worker wondering if they'll ever truly get ahead. It's frustrating to work tirelessly, only to see housing costs, groceries, utilities, and everyday essentials eating away at your income. For many, it's not about luxury or excess, it's about the basics. The feeling that no matter how disciplined or hardworking you are, financial stability remains just out of reach. That's a reality too many Australians face, and it raises a serious question. Is the system designed to keep people stuck rather than help them move forward? Let's break it down. The cost of living is crushing you, and it's not your fault. First off, let's address the elephant in the room. The cost of living in Australia is brutal. If you live in Sydney or Melbourne, you already know the struggle. Rent is astronomical, groceries seem to get more expensive every week, and don't even get me started on childcare costs. You might think, well, wages must have gone up to keep up with inflation, right? Wrong. Wages have been stagnant for years while housing, energy bills, and basic necessities have skyrocketed. Your grandparents probably bought a house on a single income with change to spare. Today, you need two incomes, a side hustle, and maybe a lottery win to even think about entering the property market. It's not just homeownership that feels impossible. Simply keeping up with rent is becoming a financial burden for many. The worst part? It's not just bad luck or poor financial planning. It's a system that feels designed to squeeze the middle class while the ultra-wealthy continue to benefit. Tax breaks and incentives often favor those who already own property and investments, while everyday Australians are left shouldering the burden. The dream of financial security, owning a home, saving for retirement, or even just affording a comfortable lifestyle, feels more out of reach than ever. If you feel like you're working harder just to stand still, you're not imagining it. And unless something changes, the gap between the haves and the have-nots will only keep growing. Homeownership? Good luck with that. Speaking of housing, let's talk about the great Australian dream. Owning your own home. That dream is fast becoming a fantasy for the middle class. The median house price in Sydney is well over $1 million. Even if you manage to save up for a deposit, which takes years, you're looking at mortgage repayments that swallow up half your income. Why? Well, let's blame negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts. OIS. These policies overwhelmingly favor investors and the wealthy, driving up property prices and pushing regular folks out of the market. Meanwhile, those who already own property sit back and watch their wealth grow while the rest of us scramble to keep up. It's not just a supply and demand issue, it's a structural problem. Investors, armed with tax incentives, can outbid first home buyers with ease, snapping up properties and renting them out for a profit. Meanwhile, aspiring homeowners are left in a cycle of rising rents, struggling to save while their dream home drifts further out of reach. The end result? A society where homeownership is increasingly reserved for those with existing wealth or family support, while the rest are stuck renting indefinitely. And let's not forget the growing trend of institutional investors buying up housing, turning what should be a basic necessity into a profit-driven enterprise. The great Australian dream hasn't just faded, it's been sold to the highest bidder. The tax system, a middle-class squeeze. Australia has a progressive tax system, which sounds fair, until you realize it hits the middle class the hardest. If you earn over $45,000, you're taxed at 32.5%, and if you're in the six-figure range, nearly half your income goes to taxes. Meanwhile, high-income earners and corporations have accountants who find every loophole possible. Ever noticed how some of the biggest companies in Australia pay next to nothing in tax? Yep, that's because they have the resources to work the system while the middle class carries the burden. Meanwhile, things like GST, which disproportionately affects lower and middle-income earners, keep chipping away at your purchasing power. Every time you buy essentials, groceries, fuel, household goods, you're paying extra, and there's no way around it. And don't forget bracket creep, where inflation pushes you into a higher tax bracket, even if your real earnings haven't improved. The government wins, and you lose. To make matters worse, tax breaks and deductions seem to benefit those who already have wealth. Negative gearing, franking credits, and trust structures allow the wealthy to minimize their tax liability, while everyday workers see a huge chunk of their paycheck disappear before they even touch it. It's a system that claims to be fair but ultimately ends up keeping the middle class stuck. You work hard, you follow the rules, and yet, at the end of the day, you're left wondering why getting ahead feels impossible. The rules are written to benefit those at the top. Everyone else is just playing catch-up. Superannuation, a lifeline or a gamble? Superannuation is supposed to help Australians retire comfortably, but let's be real, it's a mixed bag. For starters, it's tied to market performance, meaning your retirement savings can take a hit if the economy isn't doing great, which seems to be more often than not. One bad downturn close to retirement, and suddenly your nest egg isn't as secure as you thought. Then there's the fact that high-income earners can contribute more and get better tax breaks, while middle-class workers just have to hope their employer's 11% contributions will be enough. Spoiler alert, for many, it won't be. The ability to make voluntary contributions is great if you have extra money to spare. But when wages aren't keeping up with living costs, most people don't have that luxury. And let's not forget the gender gap in super. Because women are more likely to take career breaks for caregiving, they often retire with significantly less than men. By the time many Australians reach retirement, they're realizing that super alone isn't enough to maintain the lifestyle they worked decades for. Unless you've got additional investments, an inheritance, or a paid-off home, retirement might not be as golden as you'd hoped. Instead of a relaxing reward for years of work, it's looking more like a financial puzzle, one that too many Australians are struggling to solve. The casualization of work and job insecurity. Once upon a time, a full-time job meant stability, benefits, and a pathway to financial security. Today, more and more jobs are casual, contract-based, or part-time. That means fewer rights, no paid leave, and a whole lot of uncertainty. And who gets hit hardest? You guessed it, the middle class. If you're a contractor or gig worker, you're not getting employer super contributions, holiday pay, or sick leave. You're also on the hook for your own taxes and expenses, which means setting aside a chunk of your income just to cover what a traditional employer would have handled. Yet, the government is raking in tax dollars from you just the same. Meanwhile, big businesses save a fortune by keeping their workforce flexible, avoiding the cost of full-time employees while shifting the risks onto workers. And it's not just gig workers feeling the squeeze. Even traditional employees are seeing fewer protections, with companies outsourcing jobs, cutting costs, and finding loopholes to minimize their obligations. The rise of insecure work means many Australians don't know what their income will look like next month, let alone in 5 years. Without stable jobs, long-term financial planning becomes a challenge. It's harder to get a mortgage, save for retirement, or even take time off when you're sick. The shift toward a more precarious workforce might be great for corporate profits, but for the average worker, it's yet another way the system feels rigged. Higher education, expensive and less valuable. Remember when getting a degree was your ticket to a better life? Yeah, about that. University fees are through the roof, student debt follows you for decades, and the job market is flooded with graduates who struggle to find work in their field. Meanwhile, trade workers, who were once overlooked, are now in demand and earning good money without the burden of a debt. This isn't to say education isn't valuable, it is. But the cost-benefit ratio for many degrees just doesn't add up anymore. Students are graduating with tens of thousands in debt, only to enter a workforce where salaries aren't keeping pace with inflation, and career progression isn't guaranteed. Some degrees that once promised stability and high earnings now lead to entry-level jobs that barely cover the cost of living. And let's talk about HECS help repayments. They're indexed to inflation, meaning your debt grows even if your wages don't. A high inflation year? Congratulations, your student debt just got even bigger. For many graduates, it feels like they're paying off an endless bill, all while juggling rent, rising living costs, and stagnant wages. Guess who benefits? The institution's charging you tens of thousands in fees. Universities operate more like businesses than education providers, pumping out graduates while raking in money. Meanwhile, students are left wondering if they made the right choice, or if they should have just picked up a trade and skipped the debt altogether. The cost of raising kids? Insane. If you have kids, you know childcare costs are out of control. In some places, it's more expensive than private school tuition. For middle-class families, this creates a tough choice. Does one parent stay home, losing income and career progression? Or do you fork over half your salary for daycare? Either way, you're losing. The government offers rebates, sure, but they barely make a dent in the overall cost. Childcare subsidies phase out as incomes rise, but not fast enough to help families who aren't struggling by official standards, yet still feel the financial strain. Meanwhile, wealthier families can afford nannies or private care without breaking a sweat, while lower-income families qualify for more substantial subsidies. Once again, the middle class gets squeezed, and the problem isn't just affordability, it's availability. Long wait lists force parents to lock in spots before their child is even born, and in many cases the cost of care is so high that returning to work barely makes financial sense. For some families, the numbers don't add up, and one parent, often the mother, is pushed out of the workforce, setting back career progression and future earning potential. The irony? Childcare is essential for a productive economy. Yet, instead of making it accessible for all working families, the system treats it like a luxury, leaving middle-class parents stuck in a no-win situation. Okay, so we've established that the middle class in Australia is getting a raw deal. But what can actually be done about it? If politicians actually cared, there are several meaningful changes that could help shift the balance. Tax reform is a big one. The government needs to stop letting billion-dollar companies dodge taxes while squeezing middle-income earners. A system where corporations pay their fair share would ease the burden on everyday Australians who don't have access to high-priced accountants and loopholes. Housing policies also need a major overhaul. Negative gearing and capital gains tax discounts primarily benefit investors, making it even harder for first home buyers to enter the market. Phasing out these benefits for multiple property owners and focusing on affordability for new buyers could bring much-needed relief. Wages are another issue. Without proper adjustments tied to inflation, people lose purchasing power every year, even if they're earning more on paper. Ensuring real wage growth keeps up with living costs would help workers avoid falling behind. Childcare costs also need urgent attention. Middle-class families often earn too much to qualify for substantial subsidies, but not enough to comfortably afford childcare. Increasing support for these families would allow both parents to work without sacrificing most of their income. Finally, job security must be addressed. Too many companies abuse casual contracts and gig work loopholes, leaving workers without benefits or stability. Cracking down on these practices would help restore the security that full-time employment once provided. None of these solutions are radical, they're just common sense. But will they ever happen? That's the real question. The reality is the middle class in Australia is being stretched thin, while the wealthy get richer and corporations get away with murder, financially speaking. The system is set up to benefit those who already have wealth, leaving the rest of us to fight over the scraps. If you've ever felt like no matter how hard you work, you're barely staying afloat, you're not imagining it. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. The question is, when are we going to change the rules of the game? Until then, keep hustling, keep saving, and maybe, just maybe, one day, we'll see a fairer Australia for the middle class. Thanks for watching. But what are your thoughts on all of this? We'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Remember to subscribe, like, and share if you found this useful. See you in the next one.